When you think of the White House, you probably imagine grand speeches, historic decisions, and portraits of presidents hanging in gilded frames. But hidden behind all of that history, there's another story, a quieter one, told not through words or laws, but through food. For over 2 centuries, presidents and their families have sat down at dining tables inside the executive mansion. And while state dinners dazzled with fine silver and elegant menus, the everyday meals, the recipes they loved, the dishes they requested, the flavors that reminded them of home, often told us more about the person behind the presidency than any speech ever could. Some recipes reflected where they came from: a New England pudding for John Quincy Adams, a pecan pie from Missouri for Harry Truman, a bowl of clam chowder for John F. Kennedy, connecting him back to the Massachusetts coast. Others showed us the changing tastes of America: Thomas Jefferson introducing pasta and parmesan from Europe, Theodore Roosevelt's hearty game stews, echoing the ruggedness of the frontier. And then there were the oddities like oyster ice cream, turtle soup, and terrapin baked in sherry. Recipes so unusual, they remind us just how much American dining has changed over the centuries. These dishes weren't just food, they were comfort, memory, tradition, a way for presidents to stay connected to where they came from, even while carrying the weight of a nation on their shoulders. So today, we're opening the White House kitchen doors, stepping back into time, and rediscovering 15 forgotten presidential recipes. 1. George Washington's hoe cakes with honey. If you had walked into Mount Vernon on a quiet morning, long before the sun fully crested over the Potomac, you might have smelled something warm, earthy, and familiar drifting from the kitchen. It wasn't the scent of roast or ham, or the kind of elaborate dishes reserved for grand company. No, what greeted George Washington most mornings was far simpler: a plate of hoe cakes served hot with golden honey drizzled on top. Hoe cakes, a humble cornmeal flatbread, were cooked on iron griddles, sometimes even on the flat side of a hoe near an open fire, hence the name. Washington loved them so much that records show he ate them swimming in butter and honey nearly every day. And while he was the first president of the United States celebrated as a general and a statesman, in those quiet kitchen moments, he was just a man, starting his morning with the same rustic food that farmers, laborers, and families across the new republic were eating. What makes this dish so fascinating is how it bridges the story of America itself. Cornmeal was a staple of Native American cooking, and enslaved cooks in the Washington household often prepared it in new and inventive ways, shaping what became a deeply American food tradition. Washington's hoe cakes weren't just a breakfast, they were a blend of cultures, histories, and labors, all on one plate. For the president, they were comfort. Imagine the weight on his shoulders, building a government from scratch, balancing fragile alliances, trying to steady a new nation. And then imagine sitting down just for a moment to something warm and simple, reminding him of the land, the people, and the roots of the country he was helping to shape. It's almost poetic, really. The man we remember on horseback, in uniform, or in portraits with solemn dignity, he began his days with cornmeal and honey. Nothing extravagant, nothing gilded, just food that grounded him in the soil of Virginia and reminded him of who he was before the presidency. Today, hoe cakes have nearly vanished from American tables. They've been replaced by pancakes and waffles, sweeter and softer cousins in the breakfast family. But once upon a time, in the first household of the Republic, they were a daily ritual. And maybe that's the charm of this forgotten recipe. It tells us that even the father of the country found solace in something simple, something ordinary, something humble enough to be cooked on the back of a farm tool, yet sweetened by the golden touch of honey from his own hives. As we move from Washington's rustic breakfasts to Jefferson's European inspirations, the White House table begins to change, reflecting not just one man's appetite, but a young nation's growing tastes. Number 2, Thomas Jefferson's macaroni pie. When we think of Thomas Jefferson, most of us picture the Declaration of Independence, Monticello, or his love of books. But Jefferson was also one of America's earliest food explorers. Curious, adventurous, and eager to bring flavors from abroad back to his new country. Among all his culinary fascinations, one stood out: his love for macaroni. In the late 1700s, while serving as America's minister to France, Jefferson wandered through European markets and dining halls, tasting dishes most Americans had never even heard of. One that captured his imagination was pasta, long tubes of macaroni baked with cheese and cream into what was called macaroni pie. He was so taken with it that he purchased a pasta making machine and even sketched diagrams of how the contraption should work, ensuring he could recreate the dish at Monticello. At the time, macaroni pie was considered an elegant dish, fit for the wealthy and worldly. To serve it at the White House was daring, almost exotic. Imagine guests in the early 1800s, accustomed to roast meats, stews, and pies, suddenly presented with pasta dripping in cheese, baked until golden brown. To us, it sounds like comfort food. To them, it was innovation, a peek into a wider, more refined world. Jefferson's macaroni pie wasn't the boxed macaroni and cheese we know today. It was dense, baked in layers, rich with imported Parmesan and butter, with a crisp top and creamy center. It carried the essence of Europe, but was adapted by enslaved cooks in Jefferson's kitchens, blending Old World ingredients with New World hands. In this way, the dish symbolized America's growing identity: borrowing, adapting, transforming. But there's a twist to this story. While Jefferson introduced macaroni to elite tables, most ordinary Americans saw pasta as strange, foreign, even a little untrustworthy. It wouldn't become a household staple for more than a century. In Jefferson's time, it was a dish of curiosity, admired in the dining halls of the powerful but barely known beyond them. And yet, there's something almost touching about the thought of Jefferson, statesman, philosopher, architect, sitting down with a plate of cheesy macaroni pie. For all his complexities and contradictions, here he was, savoring something that feels to us so simple, so familiar, so ordinary. A dish that in his day was considered refined and rare would one day become the most beloved comfort food in America. From Jefferson's imported macaroni machine to today's stovetop boxes, the journey of this recipe reminds us how food travels, transforms, and settles into memory. What once dazzled as a foreign delicacy became in time the humblest expression of American comfort. As Jefferson's macaroni pie cooled in White House kitchens, another president would take a different approach to food, one rooted not in refinement, but in the strange and unexpected. Which brings us to James Monroe, and a dish that might surprise you: oyster ice cream. Number 3, James Monroe's oyster ice cream. By the time James Monroe took his place in the White House, America was growing bolder, more confident, more curious, and nowhere was that spirit of experimentation more visible than at the president's dining table. Monroe, the last of the founding fathers to serve as president, presided over a nation entering what historians call the era of good feelings. But in the kitchen, those good feelings sometimes produced dishes that leave us puzzled today, like oyster ice cream. Yes, oyster ice cream. It wasn't a joke, nor some whimsical culinary prank. In Monroe's time, oysters were everywhere, cheap, abundant, and enjoyed across all classes. Ice cream, on the other hand, was a rare luxury reserved for the wealthy and powerful. Combining the two was seen as daring, fashionable, even a mark of refinement. In fact, early 19th century cooks often treated ice cream as a canvas for experimentation. Flavors range from coffee to Parmesan, asparagus to artichoke, and yes, oysters. At White House banquets, oyster ice cream would have arrived in porcelain dishes, carefully molded and presented as a centerpiece. Guests likely whispered about it, perhaps politely tasting, perhaps hiding their surprise. To us, the idea sounds strange, even unappetizing. But to Monroe's generation, it was cutting edge, the kind of culinary invention that showed America could stand shoulder to shoulder with Europe in both politics and taste. And yet, Hidden in this dish is something deeply human. Think of the moment: a state dinner, candles flickering, foreign dignitaries gathered, and in between speeches and toasts, servants appear carrying plates of a frozen delicacy never seen before. That mix of curiosity, hesitation, and daring, lifting a spoon to taste something new, is the same feeling we've all had when encountering a food that pushes us outside our comfort zone. But here's the twist: oyster ice cream didn't last. Unlike Jefferson's macaroni, which transformed into a beloved staple, Monroe's frozen experiment faded into obscurity. As American taste shifted, ice cream became synonymous with sweetness, joy, and childhood. Oysters, once cheap and common, grew scarce and expensive. The combination of the two slipped away into the odd corners of culinary history, remembered only in cookbooks and records of White House banquets. And yet, oyster ice cream tells us something important about Monroe's era. It was a time of invention, of boldness, of trying new things, even if they didn't endure. It reminds us that food, like politics, is full of experiments. Some last, some vanish, but all of them mark a moment in time. From the daring oyster ice cream of James Monroe, we move next to a president who preferred something far humbler: a dish of cornmeal, molasses, and milk. For John Quincy Adams, Indian pudding wasn't a curiosity, it was home. 4. John Quincy Adams' Indian pudding. If James Monroe's oyster ice cream represented the daring experiments of a young nation, John Quincy Adams' favorite dessert told a very different story, one of simplicity, tradition, and deep New England roots. For Adams, the dish that best captured his heart wasn't lavish nor exotic. It was Indian pudding. Indian pudding was a humble mixture of cornmeal, milk, and molasses, slow baked until it thickened into a warm, custard-like comfort. It was hearty, unpretentious, and unmistakably American. The name Indian came from the Native American use of ground corn, which had long sustained both indigenous peoples and the colonists who settled the Northeast. By Adams' time, it was a staple of New England kitchens, often eaten on cold evenings when families gathered around the hearth. For John Quincy Adams, who was born in Massachusetts and raised in the tradition of plain New England fare, Indian pudding was more than just a sweet. It was memory. It was home. Imagine the contrast: the son of John Adams, who had traveled widely, who had studied in Europe, who had mingled with royalty and diplomats, yet the dish he loved most was born of the simplest ingredients, baked in the coals of New England hearths. There's something almost poetic about that. Here was a man who had seen the world, who carried the weight of diplomacy and the burdens of politics, and yet he still longed for the taste of molasses folded into cornmeal. Perhaps it reminded him of his boyhood, of his mother Abigail's steadfast New England values, of the quiet, frugal meals that shaped the Adams family's sense of discipline and duty. But Indian pudding was also more than a family dish. It reflected the American story itself. It showed how European settlers had adapted native ingredients to their own traditions, creating something new and distinctly American. Where Europe had wheat flour and refined sugar, New England relied on cornmeal and molasses, humble, local, and practical. Indian pudding was born out of necessity, but it became a dish of comfort. The twist, of course, is how forgotten it is today. You'll rarely find Indian pudding on a modern menu, even in New England. Its slow-baked style doesn't fit into today's fast-paced kitchens, and its old-fashioned flavor has slipped into obscurity. But once it was the taste of home for a president, a reminder that beneath the formal portraits and grand titles, leaders are shaped by the same simple foods that shaped their families. From Adam's steaming bowls of pudding, baked brown and fragrant with molasses, we move next to Abraham Lincoln. His choice of comfort food wasn't sweet at all, but savory, a chicken fricassee, tender and rich, served by Mary Todd Lincoln herself. And enter 5, Abraham Lincoln's chicken fricassee. When we picture Abraham Lincoln, we often imagine the tall, solemn figure at the center of a nation divided, his face lined with worry, his voice heavy with the burden of war. But in the private moments of the White House, behind the closed doors of its kitchen and dining room, Lincoln found comfort in something far less weighty: Mary Todd Lincoln's chicken fricassee. Chicken fricassee was a dish rooted in the old traditions of the South, where Mary Todd grew up in Kentucky. It was made by slowly simmering chicken in a rich, creamy sauce with onions, herbs, and sometimes a dash of wine. It wasn't the kind of grand banquet food meant to impress dignitaries. Instead, it was the kind of meal you shared with family, hearty and soothing, the sort of dish that filled both stomach and spirit. For Lincoln, who had grown up in the raw simplicity of the frontier, Mary's cooking must have felt like a blessing. He was a man of famously plain tastes, often preferring apples, cornbread, and coffee to any delicacy. But chicken fricassee, prepared with care and served hot at the family table, offered something deeper than flavor. It carried the warmth of home into the White House at a time when war made the world feel anything but safe. Imagine the scene. Outside, reports of battles arrive daily, each one heavier than the last. Inside, in the dining room, Lincoln sits with Mary and their children, sharing tender pieces of chicken in a creamy sauce. For a brief moment, the burdens of the presidency lift, replaced by the simple comfort of family and food. It's almost haunting to think that amid the darkest years of American history, there were still dinners like this: quiet, ordinary, human. There's a bittersweet twist to the story, though. Mary Todd Lincoln was often criticized. Her spending habits and emotional struggles made the subject of public gossip. But in her kitchen, she poured love into her cooking. Her chicken fricassee, remembered by guests and recorded in cookbooks, became one of the most personal glimpses into her relationship with Abraham, a reminder that food, more than politics, sometimes reveals the truest bonds of a family. Today, chicken fricassee is rarely thought of as a presidential dish. It doesn't carry the grandeur of state banquets or the oddity of oyster ice cream. But perhaps that's what makes it so powerful. It wasn't about impressing others. It was about comforting one man in one moment when comfort was needed most. From Lincoln's wartime suppers, we turn next to another president shaped by battles, but of a very different kind. Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general turned commander-in-chief, had his own favorite dish, and fittingly, it was as plain, honest, and enduring as the man himself: rice pudding with raisins. Hammer 6. Ulysses S. Grant's rice pudding with raisins. When the cannons fell silent and the Union stood victorious, Ulysses S. Grant emerged as the reluctant hero of the Civil War. Quiet, modest, and unassuming, he carried the weight of that victory into the White House when he became president. But while his military strategies were studied and his presidency debated, his personal tastes at the table were as plain and steady as the man himself. Among his favorite dishes was one so simple, so ordinary, that it might surprise you: rice pudding with raisins. Rice pudding had long been a comfort food in America, stretching back to colonial times. Made from rice slowly cooked in milk with sugar, cinnamon, and a scattering of raisins, it was inexpensive, filling, and familiar. For soldiers on campaign and families on tight budgets, rice pudding was a treat that brought sweetness to otherwise lean tables. And perhaps that's what made it so dear to Grant, who had once struggled with poverty before his rise to command. Grant was not a man of extravagance. He preferred cigars and whiskey to fine wines, plain roast beef to elaborate feasts. In fact, he often felt uncomfortable at the lavish dinners expected of a president. But rice pudding, that he understood. It was the kind of dish that carried him back to simpler times, a reminder of home, of quiet evenings away from the thunder of battle or the noise of politics. Imagine the scene: the White House dining room, set with silver and crystal, guests in their best attire. Yet when it came to dessert, the president himself might smile faintly at the sight of something plain: a bowl of rice pudding, its surface dusted with cinnamon, raisins glistening like little jewels in the creamy mixture. While others reached for finer sweets, Grant found solace in the humble dish before him. The emotional weight of that choice is striking. Here was the general who had commanded armies, the president who led a country through Reconstruction, and yet his comfort food was the same as countless ordinary Americans. Rice pudding wasn't about wealth or status, it was about memory, simplicity, and sustenance. But, like so many forgotten dishes, rice pudding with raisins has slipped from the American table. Today, it lingers mostly in old cookbooks and family traditions, rarely thought of as a presidential favorite. And yet, in its plainness lies its power. It tells us that even the man who carried the fate of the nation in war found peace in something small, sweet, and utterly ordinary. From Grant's steady spoonfuls of rice pudding, we move on to another president whose tastes reflected not just simplicity, but regional pride. Rutherford B. Hayes carried the Midwest with him into the White House, and his favorite dish was as homespun as they come: cornmeal mush with maple syrup. Number 7. Rutherford B. Hayes cornmeal mush with maple syrup. By the time Rutherford B. Hayes entered the White House in 1877, the nation was still healing from the Civil War and stepping into a new age of industry. But while the world around him changed, Hayes himself remained a man of modest tastes, grounded in the values of his Ohio upbringing. His favorite dish wasn't luxurious or exotic. It was cornmeal mush, served with a drizzle of maple syrup. Cornmeal mush was one of the humblest foods on the American table. Made by boiling ground cornmeal in water or milk until it thickened into a soft porridge, it could be eaten warm with butter or syrup or cooled and fried into slices. For many frontier families, it was a staple, cheap, filling, and versatile. For Hayes, it carried the taste of home, a reminder of the Midwest's practical, no-frills way of life. Imagine him at breakfast in the White House, the formal dining room prepared for a president, yet at the center of his plate sat a bowl of mush, steaming, golden, and simple. It wasn't the kind of food foreign dignitaries would expect to see, but for Hayes, it wasn't about impressing others. It was about grounding himself in the traditions of his upbringing, even while living in the most powerful house in America. There's something deeply American about this choice. Corn was the grain of the New World, relied on by Native Americans and settlers alike. Turning it into mush was a way of making the most of what you had, stretching simple ingredients into a meal that could feed a family. Paired with maple syrup, another gift of the American landscape, it became not just sustenance, but comfort. Hayes' breakfast table, then, was not just about personal taste. It was about carrying the heart of the Midwest into the nation's capital. And yet, there's an emotional layer to this story. Hayes's presidency began under controversy. After one of the most disputed elections in U.S. history, he faced a nation divided, its wounds still raw. Perhaps in moments of private reflection, a dish as steady and honest as cornmeal mush reminded him of simpler truths. That strength often comes from plain beginnings, and that leadership requires humility as much as power. Today, cornmeal mush has largely disappeared from most American kitchens, replaced by quicker, sweeter breakfasts. But once, it was the food of farmers, pioneers, and even presidents. Hayes's love for it reminds us that even in the highest office, there's a longing for the simple, familiar meals of home. From Hayes' plain bowl of cornmeal mush, the White House table soon shifted again, this time toward something far grander. Chester A. Arthur's tastes leaned not to the humble, but to the refined, and his favorite dish was a delicacy of another age. 8. Calvin Coolidge's fried salt pork with apple brown Betty. When Calvin Coolidge took office in the 1920s, America was entering an age of jazz, automobiles, and roaring prosperity. But Coolidge himself, often called Silent Cal, was anything but extravagant. He was a man of New England stock, known for his restraint, thrift, and simple ways. And nothing captured that better than his favorite meal, fried salt pork with apple brown Betty. Salt pork was as plain as food could be. It was a cut of cured meat, salty and hearty, fried until crisp in a pan. For farm families across New England, it was everyday fare, cheap, filling, and reliable. Paired with apple brown Betty, a dessert of baked apples layered with breadcrumbs, sugar, and spices, it was the kind of meal that reflected Coolidge's Vermont upbringing. Practical, frugal, and deeply tied to the rhythms of rural life. Imagine the contrast. In an era when America was reveling in skyscrapers and speakeasies, the president sat down to a plate of salt pork and a spoonful of warm, cinnamon scented apples. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't fashionable, but for Coolidge, it was comfort, a reminder of the farmhouse kitchens and country suppers of his youth. The emotional weight of that choice is striking. Coolidge was a man often misunderstood, seen by many as distant, reserved, even aloof. But his food spoke a different story. Fried salt pork wasn't about indulgence. It was about roots, about holding on to the simple meals that shaped his sense of discipline and modesty. Apple Brown Betty, meanwhile, carried the warmth of tradition, a dessert found in New England cookbooks since colonial times, often baked in wood-fired ovens on crisp autumn evenings. There's also something deeply nostalgic in how those two dishes balance each other. Salt pork, salty, heavy, sustaining. Apple Brown Betty, sweet, fragrant, and comforting. Together, they told the story of a New England meal as ordinary as the soil and seasons, yet somehow elevated by memory. Today, Apple Brown Betty still lingers in some kitchens, though often overshadowed by pies and crisps. Fried salt pork, however, has nearly vanished, a relic of an earlier America. But in Coolidge's White House, it was more than food. It was a quiet declaration of who he was. Not a man swept up by the roaring tides of the age, but one anchored in the steady, simple values of his past. From Coolidge's salt pork and apples, we turn to another president who knew the value of food in bringing people together. Franklin D. Roosevelt, leading a nation through the Depression and a world war, often offered his guests something close to his heart, gratin chowder. Star 9. Franklin D. Roosevelt's gratin chowder. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was many things: an optimist during the darkest days of the Great Depression, a wartime leader who guided America through World War II, and a president who understood the power of small comforts. And for FDR, one of those comforts came in a steaming bowl of gratin chowder. This dish traced back to his childhood summers in New England. Roosevelt grew up along the Hudson Valley, but he spent many vacations near the Massachusetts coast. There, fishing boats pulled in with their catch each morning, and local cooks turned the bounty of the sea into hearty chowders, dishes that could feed families, neighbors, and visitors all at once. The Groton version, named after the Massachusetts town, was simple but deeply satisfying. Salt pork gave it a smoky foundation. Potatoes added body, and fresh clams, always the star, brought the briny taste of the Atlantic straight to the bowl. Thick, creamy, and warming, it wasn't fancy food for a state dinner. It was everyday comfort, the kind that fills you up and makes you feel at home. Roosevelt loved serving chowder at Hyde Park, his family estate. He'd invite friends, politicians, even foreign guests, and often gratin chowder would appear on the table. In fact, it became something of a diplomatic dish. Visitors who might have expected French service or elaborate roasts instead found themselves ladling hot chowder into their bowls, just as Roosevelt had eaten it as a boy. In those moments, he wasn't just president. He was a neighbor, a host, a man sharing a piece of his New England roots. Perhaps that was its real charm. At a time when the nation faced hardship, Roosevelt showed that true hospitality didn't need to be extravagant. A bowl of chowder served warm and without pretense carried more meaning than any banquet hall ever could. 10. John F. Kennedy's New England clam chowder. John F. Kennedy was a man often associated with glamour, fast cars, and the charm of Camelot. But behind the polished exterior and the headlines, there was a deep connection to home and tradition. And nothing captured that better than his love for New England clam chowder, a dish that harkened back to his childhood along the Massachusetts coast. Clam chowder was more than a meal. It was a story of place and history. Thick, creamy, and filled with tender clams, potatoes, onions, and a hint of salt pork, it carried the essence of New England's maritime culture. The Kennedy family, like many coastal households, would gather around the table with bowls of chowder on chilly mornings and evenings, savoring the taste of the ocean mixed with the warmth of home. For JFK, the dish was comfort. Amid the pressures of politics, the responsibilities of the presidency, and the weight of public scrutiny, a simple bowl of chowder connected him to something enduring and personal. Imagine him at the White House, surrounded by advisors and aides, yet still asking for that familiar New England favorite. Proof that even in the world's most powerful kitchen, personal memory and tradition held sway. There's a subtle emotional twist here. Kennedy's taste for clam chowder reflected his closeness to family and heritage. It reminded him of Cape Cod vacations, his mother's kitchen, and the quiet moments before public life demanded so much. In every spoonful, there was both nostalgia and grounding, a way to reclaim his roots amid the swirl of international events and political drama. Though clam chowder is now widely recognized across America, its significance as a presidential comfort food has largely faded. But in Kennedy's era, it symbolized more than nourishment. It was a connection to family, to history, and to the shores of Massachusetts that had shaped him long before he ever occupied the Oval Office. From the warmth of Kennedy's New England chowder, the White House table would continue to evolve, blending nostalgia with regional pride, humble comfort with culinary innovation. And as we move from Kennedy's coastal traditions, we step into the hearty, rustic flavors of another president. Conclusion. The White House has always been more than a seat of power. It has been a home, a place where presidents, their families, and their guests have shared meals that comforted, inspired, and reflected the times they lived in. From George Washington's humble hoe cakes drizzled with honey to John F. Kennedy's creamy New England clam chowder, each dish tells a story of personal taste, regional roots, and the quiet moments that reveal the human side of leadership. These forgotten recipes remind us that history isn't only written in speeches and legislation. Sometimes it's found in the simple pleasures of food, the meals that grounded men and women carrying the weight of a nation, the flavors that connected them to childhood, home, and heritage. By rediscovering these dishes, we taste not just ingredients, but memories, traditions, and the heart of America itself. Even as the White House menu has evolved with time, the echoes of these recipes linger, quietly reminding us that comfort,